It is shortly after dawn on the 16th of April, 1945, and the medieval town of Rothenburg ob der Tauber lies wrapped in a fragile, uncertain quiet. Smoke still clings to the eastern quarter, where 16 bombers struck a fortnight before, tearing through red-tiled roofs that had stood since the Middle Ages. Somewhere beyond the timbered gables and half-ruined watchtowers, American guns wait in the hills, their crews watching the town through field glasses, ready on command to finish what the bombers began. Inside the walls, 6 young American soldiers stand under a white flag, blindfolded, hearts hammering, listening to the crunch of boots on cobblestones as German guards lead them deeper into a town that despises them. Local residents line the narrow streets, and some spit at the strangers as they pass. The soldiers do not know if they are walking towards a negotiation or an execution. What none of them yet understands is that within hours, their conversation with a nervous German officer will decide whether one of the most beautiful towns in Europe survives the war at all, or joins the long list of medieval treasures reduced to ash and rubble in the final weeks of a collapsing Reich. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany's military position had disintegrated beyond any hope of recovery. The Rhine had been crossed in March. American and British armies were fanning out across the German heartland, and Adolf Hitler, isolated in his Berlin bunker, had issued an order demanding that every town and city be defended to the last man, regardless of cost. For the historic towns of Bavaria and Franconia, this order was catastrophic. Many had no genuine military value, yet local commanders faced court-martial, or worse, if they surrendered without a fight. Rothenburg was a case in point, encircled by nearly 2.5 kilometers of largely intact medieval walls, with towers, gates, and half-timbered houses dating back over 700 years. The town had almost no strategic importance to either side. It sat astride the romantic road in Franconia, defended in the final days by remnants of the German 79th Volksgrenadier Division, part of a battle group operating under the 13th SS Army Corps, whose commander, SS General Max Simon, had given clear orders to resist any American advance. On the 31st of March, 16 aircraft of the 386th Bombardment Group had already dropped their loads on the town, killing 37 civilians, destroying over 300 houses, 6 public buildings, 9 watchtowers, and more than 600 meters of the ancient wall. Roughly 40% of the old town lay in ruins. Ahead loomed something far worse. Standard American practice for a defended town was to reduce it with artillery before infantry ever entered, a method that had already leveled far larger German cities. For Rothenburg, this meant near total annihilation, with little to be regained afterwards, but ash, broken stone, and the graves of civilians who had done nothing but live inside walls the Wehrmacht refused to abandon. The man who intervened was not a soldier in the conventional sense, but a lawyer turned senior official named John J. McCloy, the United States Assistant Secretary of War, who happened to be present at the headquarters of General Jacob L. Devers, commander of the 6th Army Group advancing through southern Germany. McCloy had never visited Rothenburg himself, yet he had grown up hearing his mother describe its towers and painted gables, and a framed image of the town hung in his family home. When staff officers laid out plans for a heavy artillery bombardment ahead of the coming assault, McCloy asked Devers to consider what would be lost. He reminded him of the town's 700-year history and of a local legend from the 30 Years' War in which a mayor had supposedly saved Rothenburg from destruction by draining an enormous tankard of wine in a single draft to satisfy a besieging general. Devers, according to accounts of the meeting, did not hesitate. He agreed there was no military necessity in flattening the town and ordered his staff to attempt a negotiated surrender instead of an artillery assault. The task fell to Battalion Commander Major Frank Burke of the 12th Infantry Regiment, part of the veteran 4th Infantry Division. Burke selected 6 soldiers for what was, in effect, a diplomatic mission conducted entirely on foot, inside enemy lines, without weapons raised. Carrying a white flag towards the Wildbad district on the edge of town, the group was intercepted by German soldiers, blindfolded, and marched to meet the local commander, a man named Major Thomas. According to the accounts that survive, the delegation delivered a blunt ultimatum: withdraw the garrison and the town would be spared. Refuse, and it would be shelled and bombed until nothing remained. They were given until 6 o'clock that evening to respond, or the guns would open fire regardless. What followed was not a straightforward military decision, but a quiet act of defiance against a regime that had already lost the war in every sense but the official one. Hitler's standing order was unambiguous. Every position was to be held to the last man, and officers who surrendered without explicit authorization risked summary execution for cowardice or treason. Thomas had every reason to fear that yielding the town would cost him his life at German hands, if not American ones. SS General Max Simon's Corps headquarters, still nominally in command of the sector, expected resistance, not capitulation. Yet Thomas chose to withdraw his forces rather than see the town, and very likely its remaining civilian population, destroyed for no strategic gain whatsoever. Exact details of what passed between the American delegation and the German command in those tense hours remain incomplete. The surviving accounts, drawn largely from American after-action reports and post-war testimony gathered decades later, describe fear, hesitation, and ultimately a decision made not by orders from above, but by a local officer's own judgment on the ground. Historians continue to debate how much credit belongs to Thomas himself, how much to the wider collapse of German command structures in those final weeks, and how much simply to exhausted troops with no further will to fight. What is documented is the outcome. German forces withdrew from Rothenburg without further combat. On the 17th of April, 1945, soldiers of the 12th Infantry Regiment, 4th Infantry Division, entered the town and accepted its surrender from the remaining civilian authorities, without a shot fired and without the artillery bombardment that had loomed over the town for more than 2 weeks. If you're enjoying this journey through history, subscribing genuinely helps us continue bringing remarkable true stories like this to the channel. The contrast with other German towns in these final weeks is stark, and it says a great deal about how arbitrary survival could be in the collapse of the Third Reich. Nearby Kreilsheim, caught in fierce fighting between German and American armor only days earlier, was left devastated, its center reduced to rubble in a battle its own defenders could not avoid. Aachen, captured by the American First Army the previous autumn after a German general's own secret surrender attempt was intercepted, and its author arrested by the Gestapo, endured weeks of brutal urban combat and thousands of artillery shells before finally falling, its historic core left in ruins. Dresden, firebombed in February that same year, stood as the grimmest possible outcome of what happens when a historic city becomes a battlefield rather than a negotiated handover. Against this backdrop, Rothenburg's fate stands out precisely because it did not have to happen this way. There was no dramatic siege, no columns of tanks grinding through narrow medieval streets, no house-to-house fighting of the kind that had already leveled so much of urban Germany. Instead, a frightened officer, a handful of soldiers walking unarmed under a flag of truce, and one American official's personal fondness for a town he had never even visited combined to produce an outcome that, in the chaos of a collapsing empire, was startlingly rare. Not every historic town in Bavaria and Franconia was so fortunate, and the sources make clear that Rothenburg's survival owed as much to circumstance, timing, and individual choices as to any wider Allied policy of cultural preservation. The wider consequences of that decision are still visible today: 700 kilometers of medieval wall and gabled townscape drawing millions of visitors each year to a town now celebrated as one of the best preserved in Europe. Of the roughly 950 buildings standing within Rothenburg's walls before the war, nearly 600 survived entirely undamaged, and international donations funded the careful reconstruction of the rest, with commemorative bricks bearing the names of contributors still visible in the rebuilt sections of the wall. In November 1948, the town formally recognized John McCloy as an honorary citizen, a gesture of gratitude for a decision made in the space of a single afternoon at a wartime headquarters. Major Thomas, by contrast, remains a far more obscure figure in the historical record. His motivations and his fate after the war documented only fragmentarily, a reminder that not every individual whose choices shaped history left behind the same wealth of paperwork and recognition. The story has resurfaced in recent years through local historical projects and documentary films produced around the 80th anniversary of the town's liberation, drawing on archival photographs and the recollections of residents who were children at the time, some of whom recalled being taught to fear American soldiers as monsters, only to encounter, in the town's own telling, considerable humanity from the liberating troops, including African American soldiers whose presence quietly undercut years of Nazi propaganda about race. Return, for a moment, to that April morning, to 6 blindfolded young men standing in a stranger's town, uncertain whether they would leave it alive. They were not decorated commanders leading armored spearheads into history's great battles. They were, by most measures, unremarkable soldiers sent on an unremarkable mission that nonetheless carried the weight of 7 centuries, balanced on the outcome of a single afternoon's negotiation. On the other side of that exchange stood a German officer whose name history has barely preserved, forced to choose between an order that demanded his own destruction and a decision that might cost him his life for defying it. Neither side could have known, standing in those narrow streets with an artillery barrage timed to begin at 6 o'clock that evening, that their choices would determine whether future generations would ever walk beneath Rothenburg's towers, cross its market square, or trace their fingers along walls that had witnessed the 30 Years' War 3 centuries before. There was no guarantee of success. There was no certainty that Thomas would defy Berlin, or that Devers would listen to McCloy's plea, or that 6 unarmed men crossing into hostile territory under a flag of truce would be received with anything other than gunfire. And yet, in the final chaotic weeks of a war that had already destroyed so much of Europe's architectural and human inheritance, a handful of individuals, acting on judgment rather than orders, chose preservation over annihilation. Rothenburg ob der Tauber stands today not because its walls were strong enough to withstand modern artillery, and not because it possessed some strategic value worth protecting. It survives because, for a few critical hours in April 1945, ordinary people on both sides of a collapsing war decided that some things were worth more than the momentum of destruction carrying everything else around them into ruin.